I had always known that something about the way Mike looked at me wasn't right. It was in the way his eyes lingered too long, the way his voice dipped when he spoke to me, the way his presence filled the spaces between us like static waiting to spark. But I ignored it, brushed it off, pretended I was imagining things. Until that night, the night everything changed. Mike's father was away, again, off on one of his endless business trips, leaving me alone in this high-rise apartment that was too cold, too empty. I had tried to distract myself, poured one too many glasses of wine, let the warm numbness wrap around me like a blanket. By the time I stumbled into bed, my head was spinning, my silk nightgown cool against my skin. I don't know how long I slept before I felt it, a presence in the room. The kind of awareness that sends a shiver up your spine before your mind fully wakes. My eyelids were heavy, but I forced them open. The room was dark except for the city lights spilling through the floor-to-ceiling windows, painting everything in silver and shadow. And then I saw him, Mike, standing at the foot of my bed. I froze. My breath hitched, my heart slamming against my ribs. "What are you doing?" My voice came out hoarse, slurred from the alcohol still clouding my system. He didn't answer, didn't move, just watched me. His tall frame was backlit by the glow of the city skyline, his face unreadable in the dimness. I sat up, gripping the sheets instinctively, suddenly too aware of how little I was wearing, how the silk clung to me. The air felt charged, thick with something unspoken. "Mike," I tried again, my voice quieter this time. "Go back to bed." He exhaled softly, a breath that almost sounded like a laugh, and then, finally, he spoke. I couldn't sleep. His voice was low, husky. There was something in his tone, something that sent a ripple of heat down my spine. I should have told him to leave, should have been firm, but my mind was sluggish, and the way he was looking at me, God, the way he was looking at me, made my pulse stutter. And then he took a step closer. A slow, deliberate step. I knew I should stop this, that I should get up, push him away, say something sharp enough to break whatever this was. But I didn't. I just sat there, watching as he came closer, as the air between us grew hotter, heavier, as his shadow fell over me, swallowing me whole. And when he reached out, when his fingers brushed against my wrist, I didn't pull away. I let him. I let it happen. Mike's fingers barely touched my wrist, but it was enough. Enough to make the air shift. Enough to make my breath falter. Enough to send a slow, traitorous heat through my body that I should not have felt. I should have yanked my hand away. Should have said his name in that sharp, motherly tone that reminded him who I was, who I had to be to him. But I didn't. I just sat there, pulse thrumming beneath his fingertips, my body betraying me in ways I couldn't control. The room was dark, but I could see him clearly. The sharp angles of his jaw, the way his lips parted just slightly as he watched me. His eyes weren't the boyish ones I had known when I married his father. No. These were the eyes of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. "Mike," I whispered, but it didn't come out the way it should have. It wasn't a warning, it wasn't a plea. It was something softer, something that trembled, something that betrayed the storm brewing inside me. He stepped closer, slow and deliberate. The scent of him filled the space between us, his cologne, the faintest trace of whiskey on his breath. His fingers tightened slightly around my wrist, grounding me in a reality I wasn't ready to face. "I couldn't sleep," he murmured again, his voice lower this time. The excuse was thin, fragile, but I didn't call him out on it. Because the truth was, I suddenly couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but sit there as he stood so close, his presence wrapping around me like something tangible. A warning, a temptation, a mistake waiting to happen. His thumb traced the inside of my wrist, barely there, but I felt it everywhere. I swallowed hard. "Say something. Stop this. Tell him to go back to bed." But my body wasn't listening to my mind. It was listening to something else entirely. And then, just when I thought he might step back, that the moment might pass, he did something that shattered my last thread of resistance. He knelt beside the bed. Slow, intentional, his gaze never leaving mine. And when he spoke, his voice was a whisper, a confession, a sin slipping into the night. "I dream about you," he said. The words hit me like a shock to the system. My breath caught. My heart slammed so hard I swore he could hear it. He dreamt about me. His fingers curled around my wrist, firmer this time. "I wake up thinking about you." His voice was raw, edged with something dark, something dangerous. "And when I saw your door open tonight," he exhaled, shaking his head. I couldn't stop myself. I should have been angry, should have been disgusted, should have thrown him out of my room and slammed the door behind him. But God help me, I wasn't. I was frozen in place, my body burning, my mind spinning, my pulse betraying me with how fast it raced. This was my stepson. This was wrong. And yet, when he leaned in, when his lips hovered so close to my skin that I felt the heat of him, his breath was warm against my skin, his presence so close it made the air thick, suffocating. My body was betraying me in ways I didn't want to admit, but my mind, my sanity, fought through the haze. No, this can't happen. With a sharp inhale, I pulled my wrist from his grasp, the absence of his touch making my skin feel cold. "Mike, stop," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He froze. I saw the flicker of something in his eyes. Hesitation, maybe even regret. But it wasn't enough to erase the heat lingering between us, the weight of what almost happened. His jaw clenched. He exhaled slowly, running a hand through his tousled hair, as if trying to collect himself. He started, but I cut him off. "You need to go back to your room," I said, trying to sound firm, trying to convince myself as much as I was convincing him. For a moment I thought he would, that he'd nod, leave, pretend this had never happened. But instead he let out a breath, something tired, something broken, and sat back on his heels. "I don't want to be alone," he murmured. His voice was softer now, stripped of the hunger it had held just moments ago. And for the first time that night, I really looked at him. His face was tense, his eyes darker than usual, not just from desire, but from something deeper. Loneliness. Emptiness. And against my better judgment, I let out a slow sigh. "You can stay," I said before I could stop myself, "but you sleep on that side." His eyes flicked to mine, searching, as if trying to gauge how much I meant it. I wasn't even sure myself. But he didn't push. Didn't smirk or try to test my resolve. Instead, he just nodded, exhaling like he'd been holding something in. And without another word, he climbed onto the bed beside me. I turned away from him, facing the window, my pulse still erratic, my skin still too hot. I felt the mattress shift as he settled in, his body radiating warmth beside me. Too close. Too dangerous. I woke to warmth. It took me a moment to remember why. The city skyline was blurred through the window, the early morning light casting soft shadows across the room. My body was heavy with sleep, my mind groggy, but there was something else, something wrong. Then I felt it. The slow, steady rise and fall of breath behind me, the undeniable presence of someone in my bed. Reality crashed into me like ice water. "Mike." I stiffened. At some point during the night, he had shifted closer, his body just inches from mine. His scent, something musky and familiar, wrapped around me, far too intimate. My heart pounded as last night replayed in my mind. His words, his touch, the way I almost God. I exhaled shakily, careful not to move too much, as if that would somehow erase what had already happened. What had I been thinking? Letting him stay? Letting him look at me like that, touch me like that? I should have pushed him away. I should have been stronger. But I hadn't. And now, in the quiet of morning, Guilt settled into my chest like a weight I couldn't lift. I turned carefully, just enough to glance at him. He was still asleep, his face relaxed, his breathing deep. Without the tension of last night, he looked younger, softer. And yet it didn't change what he was to me, my stepson. I swallowed hard and carefully slid out of bed, my heart hammering as I moved. His brows furrowed slightly, but he didn't wake. Good. I needed space. I needed air. I needed to get out before I did something even more reckless. I slipped into my robe, tying it tightly around me, as if that could somehow erase the feeling of my silk nightgown clinging to my skin. Then, without looking back, I left the room. The kitchen felt too bright, too open. I gripped the counter, inhaling deeply, trying to steady myself. Coffee. I needed coffee, something to jolt me back into sanity. I had barely poured myself a cup when I heard footsteps behind me. I didn't have to turn around to know who it was. Mike. The air shifted instantly, thick with the weight of unspoken things. For a moment, neither of us said anything. Then finally, I shouldn't have stayed, he muttered. His voice was rough, lower than usual, like he hadn't spoken yet today. I swallowed past the tightness in my throat. No, you shouldn't have. Silence. I turned to face him, clutching my coffee mug like it was a lifeline. He was standing near the doorway, still shirtless, his sweatpants hanging low on his hips. His hair was a mess from sleep, his expression unreadable. But his eyes, God, his eyes. They held something I didn't want to name. Something dark, something heavy, something that made my stomach twist. I crossed a line, he said, voice quieter now. I shouldn't have. He exhaled sharply, rubbing the back of his neck. I don't know what I was thinking. I let out a hollow laugh. Neither do I. His gaze flicked to mine, something flickering behind it. Guilt. Regret. But beneath that, no. I couldn't go there. I straightened my spine, forcing steel into my voice. This can't happen again, Mike. Ever. His jaw tightened, but he nodded. I know. The days that followed should have been enough to erase what happened. I told myself that over and over again, convinced that time and silence would reset the boundaries we had so carelessly blurred. But time did nothing, and silence only made it worse. I tried to avoid him. I left the apartment more often, took unnecessary trips to the grocery store, lingered in coffee shops just to delay coming home. But avoidance is a temporary solution, and every time I walked back through that door, the tension was still there, thick and unbearable. Mike never said anything about that night, but he didn't need to. The way he looked at me said enough. His eyes would follow me when I moved through the apartment, dark with something unspoken. He kept his distance, but I felt the weight of his presence in every room, like an invisible force pulling at me, daring me to acknowledge it. At dinner, he barely spoke. When he did, his voice was low and restrained, careful in a way that felt unnatural. We weren't arguing, but there was an undercurrent of something between us, something charged, something restless, something I refused to name. But none of that was the worst part. The worst part was the nights. Each evening, I told myself I would lock my door. I told myself I would put an end to this quiet unraveling before it became something neither of us could undo. And yet, every night when I finally went to bed, I left the door open. I didn't mean to. Maybe it was habit, maybe it was weakness, or maybe it was a lie I was telling myself, that I wasn't really inviting him in, that I wasn't silently waiting to hear his footsteps in the dark. But he came. Every night, sometime past midnight, I would wake to the shift of the mattress, the warmth of his body settling on the other side of the bed. Neither of us spoke. Neither of us reached for the other. But we didn't need to. The quiet became its own kind of intimacy, a slow erosion of restraint. I told myself that as long as we kept our distance, as long as there was space between us, it wasn't real, it wasn't wrong. But space is a fragile thing in the dark. One night, I turned over in my sleep, half dreaming, and felt the solid warmth of his back against mine. It jolted me awake, but I didn't move away. I lay there, breathing carefully, feeling every point where we barely touched, his shoulder blade against my shoulder, his arm just close enough that I could sense the heat radiating from his skin. I should have shifted. I should have put inches between us before it became something else. But instead I stayed there, wide awake, staring into the darkness, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing. And I knew, even without words, that he was awake too. Each night I told myself it would be the last. I would close my door, turn the lock, and create the distance that should have been there all along. I had every intention of doing the right thing, of forcing this dangerous tension back into the shadows where it belonged, but every night, my resolve unraveled. Maybe I was too exhausted from fighting it during the day, too worn down from pretending I didn't notice the way his eyes followed me, too weak to ignore the weight of unspoken things between us. The pattern continued. I would go to bed alone, and sometime after midnight, he would come. He never asked permission, never made a sound, but his presence filled the room, settled into the empty spaces like he had always belonged there. Neither of us spoke about it the next morning. The daylight made it easy to pretend it wasn't happening, to convince ourselves that as long as we stayed on opposite sides of the bed, it wasn't real. But boundaries have a way of dissolving in the dark, and I knew, even if I refused to admit it to myself, that we were edging closer to something we could never take back. The silence between us had changed. It was no longer a barrier keeping us apart, but a thread pulling us closer, growing more fragile with each night spent lying inches apart, neither of us moving, both of us listening to the sound of the other breathing. I wasn't sure when the space between us had become so small. I woke one night to the familiar warmth of his body beside me, but this time, when I shifted slightly, my leg brushed against his. The contact was brief, nothing intentional, but it sent a shiver through me. I lay frozen, waiting for him to pull away, waiting for the moment to pass, but he didn't move. The air felt heavier, charged with something neither of us was willing to acknowledge. I turned my head slightly, barely able to make out his face in the dim glow of the city lights filtering through the window. He was awake, his breathing too controlled, his body too still. The distance between us had never been smaller, and in that moment, it became impossible to pretend that this wasn't deliberate. I should have turned away. I should have shifted back, placed inches between us before the pull became too strong, but I didn't. I stayed there, heart pounding, waiting for him to be the one to break the silence, to be the one to make a choice that I knew I wouldn't have the strength to resist. His hand moved, slow and cautious, his fingertips barely grazing my wrist. The touch was light, tentative, as if giving me the chance to pull away before he went any further. But I didn't. My breath hitched, my body betraying me, my skin burning where he touched me. It wasn't a question anymore. This was happening. The room felt impossibly still, the silence thick enough to suffocate. His fingers lingered on my wrist, the warmth of his touch seeping into my skin, spreading through me in a slow, aching burn. I should have pulled away, should have ended this before it began, but my body betrayed me in ways my mind refused to accept. I stayed there, heart hammering against my ribs, the space between us too small, too charged, too dangerous. Mike didn't move at first, as if he was giving me one last chance to stop him, to take a step back before we reached the point of no return. But I didn't take it. I stayed frozen in place, pulse thrumming in my ears, my breath shallow and uneven. The weight of what was about to happen hung heavy between us, neither of us daring to speak, neither of us willing to be the one to break the spell. His touch was barely there, featherlight as his fingers traced the inside of my wrist, slow and deliberate, like he was memorizing the feel of me, like he was savoring the fact that I hadn't pushed him away. My skin burned beneath his touch, every nerve alive with anticipation, every inch of me aware of how close he was. The air between us had changed, thickened, charged with something we had spent days pretending didn't exist. I turned my head slightly, my breath catching as I found him watching me, his gaze dark and unreadable in the dim light. There was no hesitation in his eyes, no uncertainty. He knew exactly what he was doing, exactly what he wanted. But he was still waiting for me to pull away, to say no, to tell him this was wrong. But I didn't. I exhaled shakily, my chest rising and falling unevenly as my own hand shifted, fingers trembling as they brushed against his. It was barely a touch, just a whisper of skin against skin, but it shattered whatever restraint had been holding him back. His fingers slid up my arm, slow and reverent, his touch both careful and possessive. My body reacted before my mind could protest, a shiver running through me as I felt the heat of him so close, his presence overwhelming in the quiet darkness. His hand moved higher, his palm skimming over my shoulder, his fingertips ghosting along my collarbone, sending another shiver through me that I couldn't suppress. I should have said something. I should have stopped this before it spiraled into something neither of us could take back, but my lips parted on a shaky breath, and that was all it took. He moved closer. The sheets rustled as he shifted, closing the last inches between us until I could feel his breath against my skin, warm and unsteady. My heart pounded against my ribs, my pulse thrumming wildly as his fingers traced the curve of my neck, his touch slow and deliberate, like he was giving me one last chance to stop him. But I didn't want to stop him. And when his lips brushed against my shoulder, the softest, most fleeting touch, I knew there was no turning back. The moment his lips touched my skin, a quiet, lingering whisper against my shoulder, I lost any last illusion that I would stop this. His breath was warm, uneven, laced with hesitation yet filled with certainty, like he knew this was a line we couldn't uncross, but was willing to step over it anyway. I exhaled sharply, my body betraying me as my pulse raced, as my skin burned beneath his touch. His fingers trailed up the side of my neck, slow and deliberate, his thumb brushing the delicate curve of my jaw. Every movement was careful, unhurried, as if he was still waiting for me to stop him, to tell him that this was wrong. But I didn't. I turned into his touch, eyes half-lidded, breath shallow, as if some part of me had already surrendered before my mind could even catch up. The air was heavy, thick with something we had ignored for too long. He was too close, his body radiating heat, his scent familiar yet intoxicating in this new proximity. I should have said something, anything, to break the moment before it consumed us, but I only parted my lips, and he took that as permission. His mouth met my skin again, bolder this time, the warmth of his lips searing against my collarbone, trailing higher, leaving a path of fire in their wake. My breath hitched as his fingers tangled in my hair, tilting my head slightly, exposing more of my throat to him. My skin prickled with anticipation, my entire body taut with something restless, something starved. Mike. His name barely escaped my lips, but it wasn't a warning. It wasn't a plea to stop. It was an admission, a quiet surrender. He froze for the briefest moment, his lips hovering just above my jaw, his breath mixing with mine in the charged silence. The hesitation, the guilt, the weight of what we were about to do hung between us like an unspoken question. And then, as if something inside him snapped, he finally closed the last sliver of distance between us. His lips met mine. The kiss was slow at first, hesitant, testing the fragile boundary we had already shattered. But the moment I responded, the moment my fingers curled into his bare shoulder and pulled him closer, it turned into something else entirely. Something hungry. Something inevitable. The sheets rustled as his body shifted over mine, his weight pressing me down into the mattress, his hands trailing over the curve of my waist, pulling me deeper into the heat of him. Every touch sent a new wave of fire through my veins, every breath between us grew shorter, more desperate, more tangled in need. I knew this was wrong. I knew that by morning we would be drowning in the consequences, suffocating beneath the weight of what we had done. But in that moment, with his lips tracing a feverish path down my neck, with his hands exploring places I should have never allowed. I didn't care. I arched into him, gasping at the sensation, at the way his fingers tightened against my hips, at the way my body reacted so shamelessly to his. Every logical thought had abandoned me, replaced by pure sensation, by the undeniable truth that this was no longer a mistake we could undo. But just as he pulled back to look at me, his eyes dark with something primal, something dangerous, the sound of a key turning in the front door made us both go still. The apartment was supposed to be empty. Mike's father wasn't supposed to be home. Panic slammed into me, cold and immediate, shattering the haze of desire in an instant. Mike's entire body tensed above me, his breathing harsh and uneven, his eyes wide with the same realization that had just hit me like a brick. We had gone too far, and now we were about to get caught. We were about to